April 7th, 1994. It's clear skies over Memphis International Airport. Perfect conditions for a relaxed flight, but at around 3:30 p.m., a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 freighter suddenly tilts upward, rolls 140 left, and accelerates into a nosedive at over 860 kilometers per hour. The cargo plane is not designed for these speeds, but this is an emergency. Moments later, the Air Traffic Control Center receives an alarming transmission. Center, emergency. Express 705. We've been wounded. We had an attempted takeover on board the airplane. Give me a vector, please. Direct to Memphis. At this time, hurry. On board the plane are 4 Federal Express employees. 3 of them are fighting desperately for their lives. The 4th, armed with multiple hammers and a spear gun, is trying to kill them all and turn the plane into a missile. This is the insane story of the hijacking of Federal Express Flight 705. It's a captain and a first officer. But during the 90 segundos, most commercial aircraft needed a 3rd crew member to operate the flight engineer. Auburn Callaway was the flight engineer scheduled to operate FedEx Flight 705 from Memphis to San Jose. On April 7th, the day before though, his crew went above their daily allowed flying time, which meant another crew would have to operate it. But Callaway had to be on that flight. Luckily for him, FedEx let many of their employees hitch rides with other crews for free, so he could still board the flight as a deadhead passenger. They usually sit quietly outside the cockpit while the crew flies the plane. That was not Callaway's plan. The day of the flight, he was the first person to board the plane. He came with a standard travel bag and a guitar case. After him came the replacement flight engineer, Andrew Peterson. FedEx employees jumped on flights with other crews every single day, so Peterson thought nothing of Callaway. He did notice, sadly, that the captain's cockpit voice recorder was in the off position. Strange. But he just flipped it back on. Captain David Saunders and First Officer James Tucker arrived later. They said hello to Callaway and prepared the cockpit, but they didn't close the door. Federal Express Flight 705 took off from Memphis International Airport at 3 p.m. The skies were clear. At approximately 18,000 feet, 26 minutes after takeoff, Callaway opened his guitar case, pulled out a spear gun, loaded it, and picked up 2 hammers. That's Crowley's Ridge. You know about Ridge. You see all those trees there? I know it. But I wonder about that. You go in, and all the stuff over there, you know, where it's flat, and you cross over that. I wondered about that. It's not part of the Novaculate uplift and all that. That's further west, isn't it? Yeah. Altimeters, 9s, and 2s. Here after takeoff is complete. Do you all live over in Arkansas, Dave? I live in Fisher. Great spot. No. God, double quotes. First, Callaway strikes Peterson multiple times from behind. As Tucker is turning around to see what's happening, he swings a hammer into the left side of his head. Finally, he turns to Captain Sanders, who tries to defend himself, but is overpowered. After the initial attack, Peterson's temporal artery has been severed, and he's starting to bleed out. Fragments of Tucker's skull have pierced the left side of his brain, slowly paralyzing the right side of his body. Captain Sanders has severe gashes on his head, and his ear has nearly been torn off. All 3 crew members are in excruciating pain, extremely disoriented, but they're still alive. So Callaway heads back to the galley area for the spear gun. While he's picking it up, the crew has a few moments to recover. Captain Sanders undoes his seatbelt and begins slowly stumbling toward the door, while Peterson and Tucker regain consciousness. When Callaway comes back, he points the spear gun directly at Captain Saunders. Sit down. Get back in your seat. This is a real gun. I'll kill you. When Peterson sees the gun, he seizes the opportunity to grab the spear before Callaway can pull the trigger. Captain Sanders rushes toward him, and Tucker realizes he's controlling a weapon he can use to fight back. Tucker pulls back the yoke and puts the DC-10 on a 15 slope. This makes Callaway, Peterson, and Sanders fall through the door into the galley. They begin fighting for their lives. Tucker, who's flying the plane manually and has experience as a Navy fighter pilot, is now treating this as an active combat situation. The best way to proceed is to engage Callaway directly, because when he's on the defensive, he's predictable. While the fight rages on, Tucker rolls the DC-10 left by 140, almost completely inverting it. The fight in the galley is now happening on the ceiling. But while Tucker's maneuver was useful, it also hurt Sanders and Peterson. They're both losing blood and getting weaker. During the commotion, Callaway manages to strike Captain Sanders again. In the cockpit, Tucker's skull fracture has now paralyzed the entire right side of his body. But despite this, he suddenly sends the DC-10 into a vertical nosedive. The cockpit begins shaking as the speedometer tops out at 860 kilometers per hour, but the plane is going much faster. No DC-10 has ever flown at this speed, and they are not designed for complex aerial maneuvers. At this point, the plane's elevator wings begin to shake uncontrollably. If Tucker doesn't slow down, or if he levels off too quickly, the plane could fall apart. Peterson and Sanders are now fighting Callaway on the galley's wall, and he is winning. At this point, they're only fighting because of adrenaline. Once again, Callaway hits Captain Sanders in the front of the head, and Peterson has lost copious amounts of blood. But as Tucker slowly stabilizes the plane, Sanders is able to take one of Callaway's hammers and hit him with it twice. In the cockpit, Tucker radios the air traffic control center at Memphis International for help. Sir, emergency. Aircraft emergency. Go ahead. Aircraft emergency. Say again. Express 705. I've been wounded. Had an attempted takeover on board the airplane. Give me a vector. Please. Direct to Memphis. At this time. Hurry. Tucker hears the fighting intensifying in the galley, and he rolls the DC-10 right to surprise Callaway. Express 705. You're eastbound at this time. About 12:31. Look. Just keep talking to me. Okay, we need an ambulance, and we need armed intervention as well. Armed intervention is the most serious request a pilot can make. The monitor at the air traffic control center alerts the airport's emergency response team and radios Memphis approach, who's responsible for landings at the airport. 705. We have an emergency. Turn it back. Direct Memphis. He had an attempted takeover. He is wounded at this time. He's had an attempted takeover. Affirmative. He's north of Forest City by about 8 miles at this time. Okay, contact. Meanwhile, Tucker is rolling the DC-10 from left to right, but Callaway is not letting go of the spear, so Captain Sanders hits him over the head with all his strength. Finally, they manage to pin him down. At this point, Captain Sanders calls Tucker to the galley and asks him to put the plane on autopilot. He does. But the plane is flying away from Memphis Airport, and no one is answering the radio. He sounds like he's over. Get him directed toward the airport. Did they subdue the... or what? They're not sure. I heard some noise in the background. Sounded like he said he'd been injured. He didn't say shot. He said he'd been injured. Despite his paralysis, Tucker manages to limp over to the galley. He's amazed at what he sees. The room has been trashed. His crewmates are covered in blood, and Callaway is pinned to the floor. Captain Sanders walks back to the cockpit to fly the plane back to Memphis, taking all of Callaway's weapons with him. Except one. He radios Memphis approach again and asks for help redirecting the DC-10. Memphis, can you hear me? This is Express 705 Heavis 205. Yes, 705 Heavy. Memphis, Raj. Idoyer. You can proceed direct, Memphis, if able. Expect runway 9er. The altimeter is 30.29. You understand? We're declaring an emergency. We need security to meet the airplane. We'll stop it on the runway, or we can at the airport. SWAT teams, firemen, and ambulances are ready to approach the DC-10 when it lands, but that won't be simple. The airplane is over 16 tons above the recommended landing weight. Most of it fuel, because it's been in the air for less than an hour. Normally, planes simply dump fuel in case of emergency landing. But Sanders can't reach the switches safely, so he'll have to land the plane with the excess weight, which risks the tires exploding upon contact with the ground. To make things worse, Callaway is still fighting. Sanders can hear the fight intensifying from the cockpit, so at around 7,000 feet, he makes a hard decision to level the airplane, place it on autopilot, and kill Callaway. By the time he reaches the galley, though, Tucker had managed to pin him down again, so it wasn't necessary. but those few seconds complicated the landing even further. While the DC-10 was on autopilot, it stayed at the same speed and altitude. Landing it on runway 9 was impossible now, so Captain Sanders had to improvise and use runway 36 left, which was longer, but perpendicular to him. To land there safely, he'd have to turn 90 right and make a sharp 180 turn, all while descending at breakneck pace. Then he'd have to land the DC-10 smoothly enough to not blow any tires and bring it to a stop before reaching the end of the runway. These maneuvers would be difficult even for a tiny aircraft, but for an overweight freighter flown by an injured pilot with a dangling ear and a dislocated jaw, they're nearly impossible. Inside the cockpit, Sanders is ignoring the DC-10's warning systems, and in the galley, Callaway is trying desperately to reach a hammer that's lying on the floor. Luckily, Peterson grabs it before him. He is extremely weak due to blood loss, but gathering all of his strength, he strikes Callaway for the last time, stunning him for good. Miraculously. Captain Sanders lands the DC-10 without blowing any tires and slows it to a halt with barely 300 meters of runway left. The first thing the emergency response team did when they approached the DC-210 was place Callaway in handcuffs. The crew was safe now, and a disaster had been averted. By then, Peterson had lost so much blood, he barely had a pulse. He was the first crew member to be evacuated and rushed to a nearby hospital. Tucker, whose fractured skull had pierced his brain, also had to be carried down. Sanders, who could barely walk, shared an ambulance with him. Callaway was also taken to the same hospital, but he was tightly restrained in his stretcher, and he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But why did he do this? Auburn Callaway had a good life once, but it didn't last. His family was not rich, but he worked his way into Stanford, where he majored in African and African American studies. After this, Callaway joined the Navy, became a talented pilot, and started a family. Things were looking good. But when his military career came to an end, Callaway applied for a job at Federal Express. Even though he was a qualified pilot, they only offered him a lower-paying job as a flight engineer. Callaway believed FedEx had discriminated against him because of his race, but he didn't complain. He needed the job. This is where his life began spiraling out of control. Callaway was clearly unhappy working for FedEx, and after a few years, he and his wife got divorced. Although his job didn't pay enough to send their 2 children to college, he was still supporting them. But in 1994, FedEx found that when Callaway first applied for the job, he had exaggerated the number of flight hours on his resume, and he was sure the company would fire him. Before this, Callaway thought he wouldn't be able to support his children's education. Now his career was over. He was completely useless to them, unless he died. As a Federal Express employee, Callaway was entitled to a life insurance policy worth $2.5 million in the event of his death during a work-related accident. That money would guarantee a much better life for his children than he could ever give them through honest work. And so, he prepared a sinister plan. Callaway was scheduled for a disciplinary hearing with FedEx on April 8th. The day before, he would smuggle 4 hammers, a knife, and a spear gun onto a flight. He would attack the crew, take control of the plane, and crash it. When the wreckage was found, the blows from the hammers would be indistinguishable from the crew's other wounds, ensuring the crash appeared like an accident. If everything went according to plan, Callaway's family would receive $2.5 million. But the day before the flight, he was forced to improvise. Another crew would operate the flight, and he would have to board the plane as an extra passenger. Instead of 2 other people, he would have to take down 3, tougher. But he was determined. On the morning of April 7th, 1994, Callaway left his will on his bed, packed his weapons, and made his way to Memphis International Airport. He was carrying a note for his ex-wife, which read, "I would much rather go on a date. Time, place, and method of my own choosing. I resolved some time ago that the next time my security and future is threatened or seriously jeopardized, it's time, my time, to go fighting." Callaway maneuvering the aircraft and landing it safely like Peterson, Tucker, and Sanders did, was an incredible feat, especially considering their traumatic injuries. Tucker needed 3 major operations and 2.5 years of therapy to relearn how to walk and talk. None of the crew was ever medically fit to fly again. On the bright side, the event made them great friends, and in May of 1994, They received the Airline Pilots Association Gold Medal Award for heroism, the highest honor a civilian pilot can receive. Meanwhile, Callaway was charged with attempted aircraft piracy, for which he pleaded temporary insanity. He was found guilty and is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences in a federal prison, without the chance for parole. Callaway's intention was to cause an accident. Several people, including members of the crew, believe he would have crashed the plane into the FedEx headquarters at Memphis International, doing untold damage to the company and taking countless lives with him. He was supposed to have boarded the flight that day with his usual crew, 1 other man and 1 woman. Considering that he was 6'2", a black belt in martial arts, and armed, it's reasonable to assume that he would have succeeded, but this crew exceeded their 8 hours of daily allowed flight time by 1 single minute to 60 seconds. Because of that, Auburn Callaway was on board with Andrew Peterson, James Tucker, and David Saunders. It is only thanks to their heroic deeds, and this remarkable coincidence, that one of the most disastrous events in aviation history was narrowly avoided.